Scott Wong from the History Department, and today I'll be speaking about Chinese and Japanese immigration and culminating in their exclusion and their internment. Now, I often begin some of my courses or the K-12 teacher workshops that I speak at in the summer months as part of the Teaching American History initiative with the claim, Asia has always been part of American history. Well before the founding of the Republic, Asia was a major factor in the development of American society and culture, and long before the Second World War, Asia, especially China, was an important component of our foreign policy and immigration and citizenship debates. Now, this declaration often elicits some raised eyebrows, some smirks, or looks of confusion. And I then remind people that it was Asia, especially China and India, that Christopher Columbus was seeking when he discovered what would eventually become known as the New World. Now, once it was acknowledged that this landmass was in fact not Asia, many of the explorers who followed in Columbus's wake continued to look for this way around North America, a water passage, a northeast passage, a water route around North America to the Pacific Ocean, which would then lead them to Asia. Once the British colonies were established, there developed a brisk Asia trade in ports of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, connecting the colonies to China and India. It is well known that George and Martha Washington were fond of Chinese porcelains, especially tea sets. And one of the most famous events leading up to the American Revolution was the Boston Tea Party, an event that featured rebel colonists dressed up as Indians throwing Indian tea overboard in the Boston Harbor. Hence, Asian commercial goods were present at the founding of the American nation. And even after the Republic was well established and the American territory expanded with the Louisiana Purchase, Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark out on their famous expedition, in large part to find, again, that quick water passage running from the east to the Pacific Ocean in order to facilitate trade with Asia. So this drive west to the Far East would continue through the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, called by some the Iron Road to China. These rails would link the resource-rich west to the industrial east in the hopes that some of these manufactured goods could then be shipped to Asia. And in fact, the little-known town of North Adams, Massachusetts, next to Williamstown, was in 1870 experienced an influx of Chinese laborers. About 75 teenagers and young men were brought in to break a strike at a local shoe factory and stayed in North Adams for about 3 years. According to Fred Rudolph, long retired from the history department here at Williams, for a brief period of time, these Chinese constituted the largest Chinese immigrant community east of the Mississippi River. And at the same time, former slave owners in Mississippi and Louisiana were importing Chinese laborers from Cuba to replace newly emancipated blacks in the sugarcane fields, while New England's businessmen and missionaries were transforming Hawaiian islands into sugarcane plantations and native Hawaiians into Congregationalist Christians, resulting in 1898 the American annexation of the Philippines, Hawaii, and other Pacific possessions, a move seen by many as America's first endeavor of foreign imperialism. Now, despite this desire to reach Asia and conduct trade with China, however, many Americans did not have a very favorable view of the Chinese themselves. While Chinese porcelains, tea, and art objects were desirable trade items, Chinese mussels were indispensable for the development of the economy, and for missionaries, Chinese souls were the objects of conversion. Chinese people were not seen as desirable immigrants, let alone potential fellow American citizens. They were often regarded as coming from a decaying, backward civilization and were incapable of self-governing themselves in the American polity. But as Chinese immigrants began to enter the United States, they would have a profound impact on the nature of the nation's character and the sense of who was or who could become an American. One could say that immigration history is also the history of race and ethnicity in America, as well as the history for the struggle for citizenship. Soon after the founding of the new republic, Congress passed the nation's first naturalization law in 1790, which specified that citizenship would be limited to free white persons, which obviously excluded Native Americans and both free and enslaved Africans. White women were citizens, but with limited rights. In the wake of the Civil War, the 14th Amendment gave citizenship to those who were native-born, and in 1870, the naturalization law was amended to include freed Africans and their descendants. There are two important things to notice here. One, the new law did not mention color for freed Africans, but skin color would be an important issue in two landmark Supreme Court cases involving citizenship in 1922 and 23. And two, it made no mention of Asians, which meant that Asians were not considered eligible for citizenship. Charles Sumner of Massachusetts argued that all racial restrictions should be dropped, but his opinion did not carry the day. In fact, it would not be until 1952 that all racial requirements for citizenship were dropped. The first Naturalization Act did not really have a great bearing on Chinese immigrants, as there were probably only a handful of Asians actually living in the country in 1790, but in 1870, the story was quite different, as tens of thousands of Chinese laborers had just finished building the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad, and many more were already in the country. Chinese began arriving in the United States in what I call recognizable numbers in 1849 due to the discovery of gold in California in late 1848. And they were simply part of a worldwide gold rush that was taking place at that time. In fact, Chinese immigrants were similar to those from Europe and Latin America. They were leaving poor economic conditions in their homeland and finding employment in the rapidly developing and expanding United States. Their arrival as laborers, however, coupled with their cultural differences from whites, led to an increasing anti-Chinese sentiment, which led to mob violence and other forms of discrimination, such as the passage of local laws designed to curtail the social and economic mobility of the Chinese. Finally, in 1882, Congress passed the first of a series of Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited the entry of Chinese laborers into the U.S. from 1882 to 1943. In addition, the Exclusion Act prohibited Chinese immigrants from becoming naturalized citizens. Now, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was the first immigration law in American history to exclude a group of people from entering the country based on their social class and their country of origin. As the historian Erica Lee has pointed out, the issue of Chinese immigration changed the nature and character of American immigration policy from one of free immigration to one of gatekeeping. Or as another historian, Roger Daniels, has phrased it, the Chinese Exclusion Act was the hinge upon which legal history of immigration centered. Thus, it was the Chinese who would be the first group of immigrants to help lay the foundations of modern American immigration policy and the bureaucratic structures needed to enforce those policies. The INS was in fact born out of the desire to prevent Chinese from entering the country. And these exclusion statutes would have a profound impact on the class and gender composition of the Chinese American population until the mid-20th century. It would not be until after the Second World War that Chinese immigration began to resemble immigration from other countries. What were the roots of these anti-Chinese sentiments? Well, in some ways, the Chinese entered the country at the worst possible time. Coming in the late 1840s, while the American public was involved in debate over the morality of the slave trade, And the last thing many Americans wanted was another group of non-white, non-Christian people who were seen as threats to the working class, because they would indeed work for wages below that of white working men, because that's all they were offered, and because they came with a different cultural background, different religions, different diets, and other physical and social attributes. They were seen as a threat to American civilization. Now, while the epicenter of the anti-Chinese movement was in California and other states in the American West, it soon became a national issue as Chinese began to travel east after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Eventually, almost every politician from every party had an anti-Chinese platform in their political agenda. So by 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited the immigration of laborers for 10 years. It did allow for the immigration of merchants and their wives and some students. This act was renewed twice before being extended indefinitely in 1904. And after each renewal, the scope of the bill became more broad, and the definition of a merchant became even narrower. So again, exclusion would only be lifted in 1943 when the US and China were allies during the Second World War, and even then the repeal was met with great resistance by many members of Congress, and the number of Chinese who were allowed into the country after repeal was limited to 105 a year, and this was generally the case until 1965. So while the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943 and the image of Chinese Americans greatly improved so that they became what I call the good Asian in the good war, Japanese Americans found themselves behind barbed wire for much of the war. And in many ways, Japanese Americans found themselves the inheritors of the anti-Chinese movement, because they too were viewed as a threat to American labor and American civilization, and with the attack on Pearl Harbor, these sentiments came to a head. I see the internment of Japanese Americans as a process, not merely a result of a horrible event. What were the causes? Well, in 1990, the federal government issued a report on internment, and it stated that the internment was wrong and that unjustified and was caused by racism, wartime hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. And I would also add that there was a degree of economics involved too, especially in agriculture, as the Japanese had come to dominate certain parts of California agriculture by the eve of the Second World War. But the process takes a long time. Not only the anti-Chinese and anti-Japanese movements of the late 19th and early 20th century, but American diplomats and people in the government knew that we would, or had the belief that we would go to war with Japan eventually. So by 1941, in the fall of 1941, the government had an investigator go out to the West Coast and to Hawaii to assess the potential loyalty of Japanese Americans should there be a war. And he found that the Japanese would be patriotic to the United States and would not aid and abet the Japanese in case there was a war. By Pearl Harbor, however, that report was shelved and did not see the light of day until after the war. By February of 1942, FDR had signed Executive Order 9066, which then allowed for the curfew of Japanese Americans and the building of internment camps. They were first taken from their homes and were sent to assembly centers, where they were told that they would stay until the camps were built. They could only take what they could carry, and these assembly centers were often fairgrounds or racetracks, sometimes the horses being taken out of the tracks only 48 hours before the Japanese Americans arrived. Throughout the war, however, I believe that the government knew pretty quickly that they had made a mistake, because by late 42, early 43, they began allowing people to apply to leave the camps. So you had college-age students being released to go to school only on the East Coast or the Midwest, and no university that was doing any kind of research to help the war effort, which meant they were not basically going to any research universities, but were going to small schools, liberal arts colleges, mostly schools run by the Quakers. and then others left camp to go into the military. So although behind barbed wire because suspected treason, thousands of Japanese American males were drafted or recruited into the Army, and there were constant loyalty questionnaires that were passed out in camp. The most famous two questions came in one questionnaire. Question 27, will you serve in the American Army wherever ordered? And question 28, do you now renounce your allegiance to the Emperor of Japan? Now, for the first generation of Japanese Americans who weren't allowed to become citizens of the United States by law, and they were generally old, so they weren't going into the military. But this question of denouncing their allegiance to the emperor put them in a quandary, because if they denounced their Japanese citizenship, they would be citizens of no country. So some of them didn't know what to do. But it was the young men who really were at a quandary. Many of them tried to answer in a qualified manner, which was not allowed. You had to answer either yes or no. But many tried to answer, yes, I will serve in the military if you let my parents go home to California. Or yes, I will serve in the military if you restore my full constitutional rights. But the next question about renouncing their allegiance to Japan, they thought was a trick. Because if they said, yes, I now renounce my allegiance to Japan, that would be read as they once had an allegiance to Japan, which would then, they felt, justify internment. So for the 2,000 or so men who answered no and no to those questions, they became known as no-no boys, and were then taken out of camp and put in federal prison for resisting the draft. As it turns out, however, more Japanese American men volunteered to go into the Army than those who resisted, and they were put into two all-Japanese American units, segregated units with white commanding officers. They were the 442 and the 100th Battalion, and to this day, for their size, are the most highly decorated military unit in American military history, suffering the most Purple Hearts, the most casualties, and so on for a unit of their size. Now, while in camp, there is a great trauma of the family structure breaking down. Families ate in mess halls. They no longer ate together. And for many Japanese Americans, especially the older ones, the whole camp experience was a great source of shame. They felt something must be wrong with them for them to be put into camp. And so there was not much discussion after the war among the Japanese American population. The Supreme Court upheld internment, although 3 test cases, the Yasui case, the Hirabayashi case, and the Korematsu case, all tried to challenge the constitutionality of internment. They were upheld at that time by the Supreme Court. But in 1983, their convictions were overturned at the appellate level because of the suppression of evidence. However, the federal government did not appeal the overturning of those cases, and therefore on the books, internment is still constitutional. So while I said that there was not much discussion among Japanese Americans about the camps in the post-war years, they decided to keep their heads low and to become better accepted into American society. It would be in the late 70s when their grandchildren went to college and took some courses in Asian American studies on the West Coast, and they would go home and say, Mom, Dad, did you hear about these camps? Were you in camps? Was Grandmom in camp? And eventually, parents and grandparents began to open up and say, well, yes, actually, we were in camp. Your father was born in camp, and so on and so forth, which began what is known as the redress and reparations movement. And this would gather support among other Asian Americans as well. President Carter created the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians in 1980. And this went on through the Reagan and Bush administrations until 1990, when redress and reparations were settled. An apology from the government, $2,000 per survival, and a fund to keep internment in the public consciousness. All those funds have now been exhausted, and the best legacy is that at the Smithsonian Institute, which has a permanent display about internment. Obviously, many people have made comparisons with the post-9/11 situation. There are a number of statements made by the government on the evening of 9/11 saying we should not make the same mistake with Arab or Muslim Americans that we made in the wake of Pearl Harbor. And indeed, there has not been a mass internment of Arab or Muslim Americans in the months or years following 9/11, but there has been a significant harassment of that community, secret detentions and deportations, and perhaps most sad, the murder of a number of Sikhs by people who equate those who wear turbans with terrorists. Those Sikh turbans look nothing like the head coverings worn by Muslim men. In closing, I hope that this has shed some light on the early history of Chinese and Japanese Americans and how their experience has contributed to our understanding of how some immigrant groups have been received in American society and how they have adapted to their circumstances. Thank you.